Well, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all here. My name's Jane Sullivan, and I write about books for the age. I'm delighted to be here today, sitting with a man who, for once, it's absolutely true to say needs absolutely no introduction, but I'm going to do a very short introduction anyway. Michael Leunig, cartoonist, artist, poet, writer, philosopher, and a few other things that we'll get to, and very much a national living treasure. And I should tell you that when there was a ceremony to announce that he was a national living treasure and to give him his award or whatever you call it, apparently Michael didn't turn up for the ceremony because he felt that he was psychologically unable to wear a suit. Which tells you a little bit about Michael. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you, Jane.
Welcome. I thought we're talking about the life, the universe and everything today, but in particular we're focusing on Michael's book, The Lot in Words, which is a collection of articles and columns that he's written for The Age over the years on just about any subject you can mention, which makes things nice and open for us. But I thought we'd start, Michael, by talking about inevitably, I'll just turn around a bit here, inevitably the subject that's dominating everyone's thoughts this week is the bushfires in Victoria.
Yeah.
And you've done 3 cartoons this week on the bushfire theme. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit on how you got those ideas. I'm interested in the whole thing of what a cartoonist can contribute that you won't find in the reports or the photographs.
Yes, well, I think you've described the problem. What can you offer that no one else is able to offer? Or what little gap does there exist in all this talking and all this feeling? And, well, I think to be minimal was my idea. It's very difficult to address something. There's a kind of a revulsion about a lot of what happens in the media when an event like this happens. I've got this theory that disasters always happen in 2. There's the initial disaster, and then what is said about the disaster becomes another kind of a difficult thing sometimes. And it's when we find out who we are as a culture is our responses to things. And so, yes, to try and say something into that was difficult because there's a tendency to want to fall silent, and there's so many people who need to talk, and there's practical matters. So I've got a very strong impulse for silence as much as I want to show off and do things, which everybody in the media is inclined to be a bit like that, but I've also got an equal tendency to want to fall silent. Well, all I could do was try and offer my... for 10 years or 12 years, every summer's been like this for me. Living as I do, very vulnerable to bushfire, I've thought a lot about it, and I've had to face fires and do a bit of firefighting and stuff, and so all I can offer is what I know of the bush and the gum tree and the fact of nature. Just a very minimal comment on that. So that's all I wanted to do. I don't want to say too much. There's too much needs to be said by people who've been through it.
And you've been a CFA volunteer as well, haven't you, as part of your experience?
Well, yes, I have, and that was my dread on Saturday, sitting, waiting. We all knew it was going to be a terrible day, and then there's this dilemma for every CFA volunteer. You dread the phone ringing on a day like that because the thought of leaving your family and your home to go to be sent somewhere else when your own home's vulnerable, it's always a terrible dilemma. And I listened to that drama unfold. We have a little CB radio, a scanner, and I switch that on hot days in the kitchen and sit sometimes and listen. And that's where you'll get your earliest warning. It's the police talking, it's spotter planes. You're hearing all this astonishing communication traffic, and it's in his. If we're to talk about words, there's something very moving about these very concise communications, very brief, concise, practical, urgent communications. It always moves me as a kind of language because we're used to the communicators talking all the time, the trained journalists, the writers telling the stories. But to hear the police and the ambulance, the paramedics speaking their really no-nonsense language, it's so articulate in a way, and it's a language that I always find very moving. And so I listened all the day and was able to put together this mosaic of what was happening, and it was very, very moving, as I say, and horrifying. And it was miles ahead of what the ABC were transmitting. I don't know, I think it was a real failure of journalism on that day about getting out this message of where are the fires. Well, a lot was known about where the fires were in advance and which way they were heading. It seems there was no a room full of strategists sort of with a map saying this is where it's going to be in 20 minutes. And I felt that should have happened at the ABC. And I put on the ABC and I kept hearing this appalling station ID thing, a beautiful voice, a young woman's very cute voice saying, "This is ABC, your bushfire and emergency services," and some rather sweet music. And this kept on repeating and repeating. And it seemed to signify to me just how out of whack and out of touch we are with this country and the realities of it.
Maybe don't want to join calm us down, do you think?
Sorry?
Maybe it was meant to calm us down.
I don't know. I just think it's a bit cuckoo, It's a bit inane. And it's like this country, in many ways, is still too frivolous, not just about bushfires, but about what is happening in the cities, what is happening the turn of the city will come for other calamities. It's not, those fools who live in the bush who are asking for it. There are many urgent things gathering momentum, and I think there's a she'll be right sort of pleasure-seeking thing, all which is good. We love our pleasures, etc. But it did demonstrate to me something a little bit naive and silly going on. But I don't, as I was about to say, I don't want to join the chorus of all the critical voices that are now, being whipped up. But you have your natural observations on the day, and I was just reflecting on one of them.
I must say, I'm very glad to see you here today because, among other things, I read in your book there's a piece about the experience of being interviewed on the Andrew Denton show, which you call Enough Rape, and and the way you describe it, it sounds a bit like you're going to your own hanging. So is it really that bad going out in public and talking about yourself?
Well, it is. I think I know the media. I've worked in newspapers. There is this idea that there is the interviewee, who is me, and there is this great corporate group with Andrew riding up ahead. And, there's all the strategists and the planners and the producers, and they have script meetings while I'm just this lone individual who has made a commitment not to prepare any answers or to say, no, you can't ask about that, or there's no money changes hands. It's just, yes, we'll have a nice conversation. And I know that's naive, but I still want to try it. But there they all are, planning a kind of an ambush. They do. This is what the media does, and they think it's okay to do that because it makes good. They think it makes good television, but I think they miss out on a lot of truth from the person they're interviewing. I think Andrew's the policy of that show is a bit juvenile myself in that regard, because to have a really intelligent conversation which is trusting on both sides and nothing planned, it just flows spontaneously, it flows according to being attentive to each other. That would be the most brilliant sort of interview you could have. And so they miss out on all this beautiful possibility by doing this control freak stuff with a little bit of naughtiness, and we'll set you up and we'll spring a surprise. When I was asked about my marriage breakup, and I could hardly ever remember I said, but you mean the one that's 23 years ago? And things like that. It just got silly. And then, of course, Andrew's show goes to air as a spontaneous, jovial conversation. But what happened in my case, there's 80 minutes of conversation edited down to 20. Now that's a bit Orwellian in my view. And they say, oh no, we'll do it properly, we won't be unfair. Of course you'll be unfair. You don't think it's unfair, but you'll just get it the way you want it. And all the times I defend myself or I want to have a go back at you, that'll all be cut out. So it is a sort of... it's accepted as a normal process. I think it's an appalling process and it doesn't produce good results.
Well, of course, my ambush is coming up any minute.
Oh, it's all right. But you see, we're live, aren't we? No one's going to edit this, and it's beautiful too. Live ambush is terrific. I love it.
Now, there's another piece in here that touches on the same things, how to be a cartoonist.
Yes.
And there you talk about how you have received absolute adulation and absolute hate, often from the same people. How do you cope with that?
I live in the bush. I don't know, Jane. I don't know. I think we all know this. Is there a person in this room who has not had love and hate from friends and, all this confusing thing?
You probably had more than most, though.
I have, and there must be mechanisms which I haven't. It's odd, I must say. I'm looking here and I'm looking there, so forgive me if I seem it's somewhere lost in the middle, but there's a tendency to look both ways. To them, yeah. How do I cope with that? I think it deepens you somewhere you think about. You see a lot of things that you wouldn't otherwise understand about your society. It does afford me a very interesting view of society in some ways. People reveal themselves to me. They reveal. And if you do anything, if you stand up in the world and have a voice of any sort, if you're privileged to do that or you want to do that, you will find that those who don't want you to do that, and then your professional envies and all these this opera, of human emotion that happens, it grows you up pretty fast. But I guess we all do this. We all encounter this in our lives. But being a public thing... See, I started cartooning because I didn't have an education. Education and I didn't get along very well. But I grew up in what we said was a working class kind of culture. And the problem was, how do you get a roof over your head? How do you keep the wolf from the door? How do you get on your feet in this life and become a going concern if you haven't got an education? So I started drawing by accident, and someone paid me $5 or something for a little drawing, and then someone else said, oh, would you do us one of those drawings? And someone else pays you $5. It's like being a musician. Gradually you get a gig somewhere and you get asked to do what you do. Now, you're not thinking of being a public person at that point. You're just loving to draw and make little sparkly, funny things that amuse you in the moment on the desk yourself. So it begins like that. And then one day you wake up and, there's a death threat on your in your mail or whatever, or whatever comes your way. It's this thing we're all aware of in our society. If people get picked out or they push themselves out and they become what others, I don't know, famous or something. And it's only it's only in this town of Melbourne or something, or where, who knows what it is. I don't know, because I've always retained a very strong love of the things, the earth and the garden and all my things I do. It does, a lot of it goes over my head, really.
Well, that love of what you've retained certainly comes out in your book. I'm wondering, though, looking back on all those cartoons you've drawn and the reaction they've got, are there any that you regret drawing?
Only one, and that was about Darren Hinch, would you believe? the radio broadcaster, because it was just unfair. I remember once when poor Darren was crusading about something, he acted against the court order, saying you mustn't publicise the details of this man's crime.
He did that quite a bit, yeah.
And he was being quite insufferable about it in some ways. And it was silly. I was much younger, and he was sentenced to some time in jail. And I did this really silly juvenile drawing it just said, scenes of jubilation in the street when Darren Hinch was sentenced to jail. It was awful, and there were people dancing through Melbourne, and I do regret that. It was cruel. A man has been sent to jail. He was acting in conscience, he was, and for some reason, a small personal matter, but I felt that was a rotten thing to do. And I've always had trouble with political cartooning, about nailing somebody. It's what steered me away from political cartooning initially and made me draw ducks and funny things. I had a problem about going after someone and capturing. So, a lot of cartoonists say, they've captured them. You see, you don't capture them. You look like you capture them. There's a certain trick. You make the eye look this way and it all looks very profound, but you don't capture a person I'm not sure that that's the truth, that someone is captured by a drawing.
But of course you have been very political in your drawings and your writings about, for example, what's been going on in the Middle East, and you've copped a lot of flack from that.
Well, the Middle East is something you don't want to go near too often. I mean, if you ask any cartoonist in this country, which is the one subject you are very worried about going near, they'll say the Middle East. Because the pressures that are brought to bear on you for practically anything you say are so huge as to be not a good part of our democracy. We say, yes, we're free to say it, but if the pressures are so harsh that they're censorious, I don't like that. So I haven't done so many on the Middle East, but about every one I do, I seem to get into trouble for. It's only that many cartoons in a few years.
And you have been censored in that area too, haven't you? You've had cartoons that won't run.
Yes, I have been censored. And I did accept, there was a famous one I did, and I accepted, the editor of The Age, Michael Leunig, censored it. I said, OK, Michael, we had a big argument on the phone. I said, Michael, it's your call, it's your paper. Pull it out, I'll do a new one, and we won't say no more about it. It's a secret between you and me. He said, yeah, OK. Next morning, the phone rings. Someone at The Age had sent it off to Media Watch. And it was assumed that I had, but I hadn't. So, things get out, and then it's all a big kerfuffle, and then next minute it gets sent off to the Iranian newspaper and as an entry in a international cartoon competition about the Holocaust. And then there's helicopters landing in your back paddock, literally. And so that's how it happens.
Yeah. It sort of creeps up on you and explodes.
It does. And you're just still working with a naive view that you just get affected by things. I mean, we're affected by this bushfire and this human suffering. 3 weeks ago, I was distraught about people in Gaza being bombed from the air. Now, 300 might be dead here. There are 1,300 there. And this might sound naive, but I still do not understand why I should not feel incredibly distraught about Gaza. You see, I'm perplexed by this, and I have always been perplexed. And I was going through real emotional distress about that, because and in Iraq, and maybe it's the time of the Vietnam War. We all live with terrible risk.
Michael, can I ask you one thing which really struck me in this book, which was when you were young, you had a period where you were working in a slaughterhouse.
Yes.
And you actually had at one point to hold the gun that was killing the animals. And you mention in that piece that you reckon that all politicians who send people out to war should have to have that experience of actually killing a living creature themselves.
Well, of course, I'm not going to organise this compulsory thing, and I don't know how to do it. But no, it's always struck me. Coming, as I say, I grew up in what we called a working class suburb. My father was a slaughterman. People around me, fathers, there was the meatworks. As a boy growing up, there were fights in the street. There were bullies. You got bashed up. It was a more physical, and you saw blood. You saw blood. And there's something about that. People say that would brutalise you, but do you know, it sensitises you too. You understand the meaning of a blow to the head. You understand the meaning of a throat cut. You see the blood flow out of the animal. This matures you deeply. And I worry that politicians come from a class quite often who are detached from these things. They have not contemplated, like the Buddha, reflecting upon the decomposing corpse. You have to have I've lived it and felt it somewhat to understand the implications of sending an air force against a people, or that's what I didn't like about John Howard's sort of what he expressed. There was or Alexander Downer, I don't know, disconnection from the bodily sensation of violence and the consequences of violence.